Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KON Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. Woolsey, who is former head of the CIA, he came out. He's part of an organization that is warning about EMP, electromagnetic pulse. And really excellent website. I'll try to get that for you before the end of the show today. It basically describes the threat that we face. And it's extraordinary because I wasn't aware of this. Maybe some of you have heard about it. I did not know this. Apparently, back when we were having the brinksmanship with North Korea, you remember that a couple of years ago? North Koreans getting ready to test. We were telling them not to. Anyway, the end result of that was that the North Koreans, during the course of this brinksmanship, they have a satellite that orbits. They're able to change the orbit of that satellite. It apparently generally traverses the Earth outside of our early warning radar's range. So we don't always, I guess, know at least where it is from on the ground. Of course, I'm sure we got plenty of eyes in the sky in orbit. But during the time frame that this happened, they actually directed that satellite over an optimum position in the United States that if there had been a nuclear weapon on that satellite, even a low-yield weapon, and had they detonated it, it would have taken out almost the entirety of the electrical grid in the United States. It would have set us back generations. It would have killed millions eventually. Shutting down the electric grid in the United States, it's not just losing your electricity. It's losing everything that goes along with it. Transportation networks down, hospitals down, electronics down. And I'm sure that there had to have been an article out there. I missed it. It should have been front page news. But you know what? The Iranians also have a satellite. They probably have more than one, but they have the capacity as well to do the same sort of thing. If they've launched, for example, a satellite that has a low-yield nuclear weapon on it, it doesn't take much. I mean, a lot of people think that what's required is, some sort of massive megatonnage bomb detonating in the atmosphere to create the type of havoc that could push the United States back into the dark ages. It doesn't require that at all. It's just a low-yield weapon. And the thing that's interesting about the electromagnetic pulse nuclear weapons is it's pretty broad spectrum. And the damage it can do is far greater than the damage that has been created by natural events in the past. That's one of the other things that Jim Woolsey talks about in this study, where he suggests that, look, we have seen in the past events that if they hit today would be catastrophic to the country. So much so that if you look back to the 1859 event that occurred where telegraph lines were melted, transatlantic line had problems, telegraph stations caught on fire because of a solar flare. And we just missed one a couple of years, several months ago, I guess, by 3 days that would have had catastrophic impact. The electronics today only require a very small fraction of what happened back in the 1850s to destroy. We aren't hardened in this country. We aren't hardened against EMP, either the nuclear type or the natural type. But Woolsey, he talks about why we aren't hardened. And he mentions that the House of Representatives voted out a protection program back in 2010. I thought it was late 2009. He says it was 2010. And it was a unanimous vote in the House. Guess what? It got stopped in the Senate. Guess how it got stopped? One senator put a hold on it. Guess who that senator was? Our very own Lisa Murkowski. So, if we end up, and by the way, that protection, according to Woolsey, would have protected us against broad spectrum, not just nuclear EMP, but also natural EMP. So, could you imagine? We get hit by a solar flare. We get the North Koreans or the Iranians decide they want to hit us in our Achilles heel. And that's really what this is, by the way, folks. It is the soft underside of the United States. A very, very easy way to take us out. It doesn't take a high tech. You've got to be able to launch a satellite. You've got to be able to detonate a nuclear bomb. Those are not small undertakings. But some of these backward countries have even gotten to that point now. The North Koreans have the capacity. The Iranians have the capacity to at least launch the missiles. North Koreans have demonstrated a capacity to detonate a nuke. Some believe that Iran is very close, if not already there, on the nuclear side of it. But, if you want to take out your main adversary, the one entity in the world that's creating you problems, well, obviously besides Israel, What would Iran like to do? Well, it's easy to do. We aren't hardened. And why aren't we hardened? Well, because apparently the money wasn't going to the correct crony. I never did hear an explanation from Murkowski as to why she stopped it. Maybe one of her supporters out there knows why she stopped it. We hit her pretty hard in 2010 on that when I was running for office, and we never got a good explanation. It's called crony capitalism on steroids, and she is a willing disciple of that model. That's what makes her function. It's what, of course, funded her back in 2010. But she is without excuse to leave this country naked to the EMP threat, because that's where we're at. And the EMP catastrophe, something that we all ought to be concerned about. It shocked me, though, to hear the former CIA director talk about how this is something that, even a small coronal mass ejection from the sun can create. And that these things, there apparently every decade is a 10 or 15% chance of a catastrophic coronal mass ejection, an EMP, natural EMP, to devastate the electronics of this country. That's a horrifically high percentage, especially when there are predictions that the majority of the people of this country would be dead if we lost our grid eventually. It would take several months. By one calculation, a year, 90% of the country dead. You would think that you'd spend a few $1 billion on that rather than the hundreds of billions that you're spending on the social welfare state. I don't get it. Maybe somebody else has an explanation. Anyway, more on this, other subjects after these messages. The Joe Miller Show. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. So we're talking about the EMP threat. Lisa Murkowski, our own senator, could be responsible for the destruction of the nation if, in fact, an EMP by hand of man or nature is created because of her 2010 action of saying no to the hardening of our grid. It's a bad thing. Let me just kind of finish up briefly with that. Woolsey, again, he wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal recently, and then this was followed up with Forbes. He has a website out there, too. I'll try to get that to you before the end of the show. But he took part in a question and answer with Forbes. He was asked, what would the United States look like without a grid? In other words, after an EMP hits, either by a coronal mass ejection from the sun or by one of these rogue countries like Iran and North Korea. And by the way, he's very concerned about the nuclear deal with Iran as well because of how it may enable Iran to get the weapon necessary to actually do something like this. And let me also add, it is without question clear that both North Korea and Iran have been working on developing an EMP weapon because it's the mass equalizer. I mean, think about it. Never before in the history of this world could you take, and Iran's not real backward. North Korea, of course, is backward. They're both backward in many different ways. But what I'm trying to say is they aren't a backwater third world nation. They both have some technological prowess that other countries don't have, but they're still at best second world. Really, they're still in the third world class, but maybe upper third world. They both have been focusing energy and expertise on EMP weapons because they understand that even though they may be a fraction of the U.S. economy, they, with a very low-cost weapon, could send us back to the Dark Ages. The first time in history have we been in such a situation where the tools of asymmetrical warfare are so incredibly effective. And they can expend a couple $100 million on their EMP weapon, and they may be able to take out $1 trillion defense program. Well, anyway, Woolsey says that if the EMP hit the United States, whether through natural or man-made forces, it would be very bad. He says the destructive force of an EMP would knock out the grid for a year, maybe longer. That's because the parts needed to fix the transmission lines and transformers destroyed are mainly made in only two places, South Korea and Germany. I thought China was one, but he says it's South Korea and Germany who do it. The EMP Commission, which was set up after 9/11, estimated that within 12 months of an EMP event, 2/3 of the United States population would die from starvation, disease, and societal breakdown. Other experts estimate that likely loss to be closer to 90%. So this is not Joe Miller exaggerating. This is not me trying to put everybody into fright mode. This is former head of the CIA saying, hey, look, folk, this is a real threat. 90% of our country could be dead in a year, and yet Lisa Murkowski says, no, we aren't going to do anything about it because she cares about one thing, and that's herself and crony capitalism. So, the question that Forbes asked Woolsey, they said, well, is it really that bad? And basically, he said, look at, there's a novel that was written called 1 Second After. It gives a chilling portrayal of what life may look like after an EMP detonation. It describes a population totally unsuited for living in the dark. Death comes in waves, first the elderly, then those who depend on medication. Following that are those who die of simple diseases like thyroid or dysentery, as well as those who have no survival or farming skills. And just think about it. Just think about it in the cities. Even some in Anchorage. I mean, we are so ill-suited in modern society to survival. So many people think that, food comes from the grocery store. You don't actually grow it. I just go down there and buy it. Now, here in Alaska, for you that are live streaming, you might not understand, but Alaska, some places like Fairbanks, there's an estimate that only several days of food exist on the shelves. So you shut down the plains, what happens? You're without food unless you grow it yourself or you kill it yourself. Of course, the problem is one of these things go down, and every moose within 200 miles will be dead within 2 weeks of Fairbanks. Anchorage, for that matter, probably even worse, maybe a week. So anyway, it's bad stuff, folks. It's something that we need to get aware of, put pressure on our political leadership to do something about, get their heads out of the sand. Coming up next, we've got another great guest, Linda Royale. She's going to talk about big business and bad government, how D.C. has known about the buying and selling of baby parts for years but has done nothing about it. Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show.